From Santa Barbara, California, Timeless Voyager Radio with Bruce Stephen Holmes. Self-development radio for the open mind. Interviews with leading-edge authors and speakers in the field of environmental issues, alternative healthcare, new psychology, psychic phenomena, UFOs, and extraterrestrial encounters. And now, Bruce Stephen Holmes for Timeless Voyager Radio.
Good morning, everyone. This is Bruce Stephen Holmes for Timeless Voyager Radio, and I want to welcome all of you to the show. It's a very, very beautiful day here in Santa Barbara. For those of you listening in other parts of the country, it's probably very cold. My guest today, very influential man in most communities of information. The gentleman, Wiliam Cooper, the book, Behold the Pale Horse, 500 pages of well-documented, most suppressed information ever published in the history of the world. Welcome to the show, Bill Cooper.
Thank you. Good morning.
500 pages of the most suppressed information ever published in the history of the world. That's a tall statement.
Well, it's not only the most suppressed, but in my book, it's the most well documented. We are, as a whole people, I believe, and have been for many, many years, living in a fantasy world. The real world is much different than what the average American would ever believe without going through a process of research and enlightenment that would literally shatter everything that they've been taught in their life.
So, how about an example? Something perhaps that's happened in the last few months, a good example of what happens with media and how we are being fooled.
Well, I could give many examples. The inflationary period in the 70s, which was blamed upon a higher price of a barrel of oil, the price being set by OPEC, is sheer fantasy. The truth is that inflation cannot be caused by the price of oil or the price of cement or the price of wheat or anything else. Inflation is caused by the printing of more money which has no backing, or the making available of money in the form of credit, in which case there's no currency printed whatsoever. This creates more money in the hands of the people, which enables them to demand more products. For instance, more people could buy real estate and homes. The result of that is that the prices of those items go up because our economy is based upon the supply and demand, and that's what causes prices to rise or fall. Another example would be the Gulf War, which was rehearsed for many, many years. There was a book printed in 1985 called U.S. Rapid Deployment Forces, printed by Arco Press, in which they outlined an operation called Operation Bright Star, which was conducted every single year by sending troops to the Middle East to practice liberating a small country which had been overrun by its neighbor. In the book, the country named was Kuwait, and the neighbor, of course, was Iraq. And so this was outlined. The whole scenario was planned. It was put into effect and rehearsed for many years. And what it actually did was not liberate Kuwait. What the truth of the matter is that we gave Saddam Hussein the go-ahead to go into Kuwait. The ruling class of Kuwait was in on this from the beginning. They benefited from the reduction of a population which was becoming burdensome to them. This was also a benefit to Iraq. And it established for the first time in the history of international law and the United Nations, that the United Nations has the authority to pass a resolution and then send a police force to enforce that resolution and then require the member nations to foot the bill for that police action. It was, in fact, as George Bush said, he called it his fifth agenda, was to create a new world order. It was, in fact, first and foremost to begin the process of creating a new world order and transfer sovereignty from nations to the United Nations, and established in international law that what used to be under the law of the world, independent sovereign nations answerable to no one but themselves are another nation with an overwhelming military force. It then set the precedent that nations are answerable to the United Nations and not to themselves.
Bruce Stephen Holmes, Timeless Voyager Radio. My guest today, William Cooper, author of Behold the Pale Horse. 500 pages of the most documented information about the suppression of, looks like, everything. What made you decide on the title?
Well, what's happening in the world today would give the impression that the fulfillment of the prophecy in the Book of Revelations and Nostradamus and many others are actually coming to pass. But if you read my book, you begin to understand that this is part of the bringing about of their new world order, a one-world totalitarian socialist government, which we're in the process of being incorporated into. Part of this is to convince people by actually creating incidents that fulfill prophecy in order to neutralize large segments of the population so that they will not oppose the destruction of the sovereignty of nations, and for instance, in our case, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and actually coming under the aegis of a foreign power, which is the United Nations. You see, we're only one nation in the entire world, and even though we have a veto in the Security Council now, that's not going to last. Eventually, we will be subject to the whim of the vote of the General Assembly and the decisions of the Security Council, when most of the nations of the world may go against us. So what we're looking at is a complete change in the entire structure of world order, and a shift in the power from what used to be the Soviet Union and the United States to a large number of third world countries who can outvote us. We're going to see a tremendous shift of wealth and natural resources from the industrialized nations to the third world countries, and that's what these trade agreements are all about.
Now, Bill, you have been very well known, of course, in the UFO community, and how does the UFO community, with its own conspiracies, how did that bring you into this information that you are now talking about?
Well, most people realize by now that what is popularly known as UFOs are real. They would be real in any event, because UFO simply means unidentified flying objects. So if you look up in the sky and see something that is so far away you can't identify it, that classifies as a UFO. But I'm talking more specifically as these strange craft that seem to defy the laws of physics as we know them, and have been cited by millions of people all over the world. And these people are not kooks or nuts or wackos, although there are an overwhelming majority of that kind of people attached to what you call the, quote, UFO community, unquote, the woo-woo crowd, if you will. These sightings are real, and these craft are also real, and they do appear to defy the laws of gravity as we know them, or the laws of physics as we know them. However, in my research, I have uncovered the fact that there is indeed a secret space program that's been going on since approximately 1954, was ordered by General Eisenhower when he was president. Previous to that, the Nazis had experimented with this technology previous to and during World War II, and it had actually developed disc-shaped flying craft, which they perfected to the point where they had been test-flown, and some of them were actually used as weapons against our bombers. And those were called Foo Fighters. They appeared to be round balls of fire, which was nothing more than the sighting of the exhaust from the propulsion system of these discs. They would fly close to our aircraft and put out an electromagnetic field which would disable the electronics in our aircraft and cause them to deviate from their planned target. And many of them had engine shutdowns and complete radio failure, and they would begin to fall from the sky until they left the immediate vicinity of these so-called Foo Fighters, and then they would regain their electronic power and be able to restart their engines, and at that point they would usually turn around and head back home, thus not completing their mission. So this technology, to a small extent, was successful in the war. If they had ever developed these craft to the point where they could have mounted weapons systems upon them, they would have had control of the air, and the tide of the war would have been turned. Unfortunately for Mr. Hitler, we won the war before he was able to perfect the disc-shaped flying technology. And we, the Russians, Canada, Great Britain, and most probably Australia, captured portions of this technology post-war, and we're perfecting it and have been perfecting it ever since. So we know that Russia, the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and maybe Australia have perfected this technology and have been flying it since then. Now, in my research, I located a plan that goes all the way back to 1917, and I believe even before that, where the first inkling that I had that this plan existed was a speech made by John Dewey in 1917 in New York City to the visiting Japanese delegation headed by Viscount Ishihi. And basically what he said is the very first sentence of the speech that he made that night, and remember, bear in mind that this was 1917, John Dewey, who by the way is the father of our failing educational system, public education system, made this statement, quote, the best way, he said, quote, someone once told me that the best way to unite all humanity in a one-world government and do away with war forever would be if we were attacked by some other species from some other planet, unquote. This has been echoed throughout the years, and I believe that the radio broadcast by Orson Welles in the Mercury Theater in 1936 of the War of the Worlds, which created an actual panic along the East Coast and caused the stock market to drop precipitously the following morning, was in effect a test of whether or not this plan would work, whether the American public would be gullible enough to believe that there were, number one, actual extraterrestrial beings that came from somewhere else that could traverse the great expanse of space and actually come here and threaten us. The test was extremely successful, and I believe that the only thing after they made that test that they needed to do was develop a technology that would convince the American people and the people of the world that extraterrestrials, number one, were real, number two, were here, number three, were technologically superior to us, therefore represented a threat. This would cause all the peoples of the world and the nations of the world to be willing to drop their sovereignty, their national sovereignty, and unite in a one-world government in order to pool the resources of the world to face this threat. Now, it wouldn't make any difference whether they were outwardly hostile or not. The fact that they existed would, in fact, constitute a threat if they came here first and were technologically superior. Now, whether they're real or not, I believe that is exactly what this UFO presentation that's being made to the world is designed to create, and that's an artificial external threat to the Earth to facilitate the formation of a one-world government.
Now, many of us in the UFO community understand that if there are higher intelligences, most of them, let's say 95% or more, would abide by a non-intrusion treaty in the first place. So those would be positive, let's say, or angelic, or somehow at least life-supporting for us. So the point, I guess, that you're making is that the entire idea then would be to scare the public into thinking that if anyone out there is able to come here, they'll come here for reasons of enslavement.
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is just the fact that they exist would constitute a threat. When you meet someone that you do not know and you have no idea who they are, what their intentions are, or what their history is, you cannot trust them blindly. And number two, as far as your statement goes, there is no evidence existing anywhere in this world that extraterrestrials are real, much less that they're here. We know that the craft that are flying around in our skies are real, and we can prove that at least some of them are owned and operated by human governments and controlled by human control here on this earth. When you can't even prove that someone from somewhere else exists, how can you sit down and decide or dictate what their policy would be? That's absolutely ludicrous. Number one, even if they did exist, and even if we could prove it, it would in no way dictate that they would be harmless or harmful, or that they would have a non-intrusion policy or anything else. This is all the woo-woo stuff, and it's wishful thinking, and it's mostly 100% bullshit.
Now, what do you think of the possibility that the Bible then is an inaccurate document?
Well, considering that the Bible was dictated and put together under the aegis of a pagan, sun-worshipping Roman emperor named Constantine at the Council of Nicaea, I would say that there's a good possibility that the whole Bible was put together and written in order to control large segments of the population. And I'm not saying that that's the case or not the case. I'm just saying that because the man who was overseeing the actual formation and the selection of the books and passages that would be included in the Bible was a pagan Roman emperor whose first and foremost interest was preserving the Roman Empire and his own throne as emperor of that Roman Empire, I'd say the possibility exists.
Timeless Voyager Radio is the show. My name is Bruce Stephen Holmes. My guest today, Bill Cooper, author of, among other books, Behold the Pale Horse. We're talking mostly about some of the greatest suppressed information in the history of the world today. You'll be able to talk directly with Bill and myself, 893-2424, 893-2425, 893-2426. Barbara is our listener today. She's screening the calls. If you're interested, you can begin calling in now. We'll start taking calls in about 5 minutes. Bill, you obviously are one of the most controversial people in this entire area. What did you think about the Waco, Texas incident?
Well, as you know, I was a member of the Office of Naval Intelligence when I was in the Navy many, many years ago, and I also have a radio broadcast from WWCR, which beginning on the 27th of December will be broadcast on 5.890 at 10 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. It's 9 Pacific, 11 Central, and midnight Eastern, called the Hour of the Time, and that's Monday through Friday. And when I heard what was happening in Waco, I knew instantly that something was very, very wrong. Like everyone else, I was sitting watching CNN, which I normally do at that time of the day, just to get a gist of what's going on in the world before I begin to find out, or at least what they're telling us is going on in the world, before I begin my day of trying to find out what's really going on in the world, which is usually quite different from what we're told. I saw a press conference held by a member of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, in which he stated that they had just performed a raid on a religious cult in Waco, Texas. They called it a religious cult called the Branch Davidians, and they had suffered 4 dead and 16 wounded, and that the situation was very bad, and that they were actually placing these people under siege, and that he stated that the reason that they made the raid was that they had a communique from a foreign source through the State Department that the members of this church were getting ready to commit mass suicide. Now, that was the first thing that they said on February the 28th, 1993. I immediately knew that the man was lying. Most people accepted what he said because most people are sheeple. If they're not just living in an abject state of stupidity, they are sheeple, ignorant, and unquestioning, and they've been brainwashed never to question what they're told by someone in a position of authority. The truth is that suicide is not a federal crime. In fact, it's not a crime at all on the federal law books. And number two, even if it were, members of a church in Waco, Texas would not fall under federal jurisdiction. Therefore, there should have been no federal agency there dealing with any kind of a projected suicide. Number two, anywhere where suicide is a crime, it's not a crime until it happens. So someone planning suicide would have come more properly under the supervision of psychologists or psychiatrists and not a law enforcement agency. So I had several reasons to know that this man was lying. And another reason is that even if they were planning to commit suicide, and even if it had have been a federal crime, and even if the federal government had sent someone to deal with this, it would never have been the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which is an agency that was created during Prohibition to levy a tax on alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. They are not a law enforcement agency. They are a taxing agency. Therefore, there's no reason that those people should have ever been there at all. So basically, I packed up my gear and went to Waco, Texas, and covered it on site. I went to the press conferences, and I found out that we were lied to from beginning to end. No one really knows what it was really all about, but it wasn't about any of the things that we were told. There was no child abuse. There was no child molestation. David Koresh did not have several wives and was not sleeping with all of the women in the compound. They did not have any illegal weapons whatsoever. All the weapons they had were purchased legally. Two of the members of the church had federal firearms licenses. It was one of the methods that they used to earn money to support the church was that these two members attended gun shows across the country, and they bought and sold firearms weapons. And in fact, on the day that the raid was made, Paul Fata, one of the two members who had a federal firearms license, had taken most of the weapons from the church to attend a firearms show in another city. So most of the weapons that they claimed that these people had were not even there to begin with. The weapons that they did have and that were with Paul Fata were all legal weapons. There were no machine guns, there were no hand grenades, there were no rocket launchers, and the whole reason for this thing is obscured, but eventually, as we continue to dig, we may be able to find out exactly why this was done. But for whatever reason, it was not a United States police action anyway. The police action was conducted by the International Monetary Fund under the United Nations. It consisted of anti-terrorist guerrilla warfare teams of the Department of the Special Operations Division of the Department of Defense called Delta. It consisted of members of Interpol. There was a United States Navy SEAL team on site. They had military psychological operations warfare teams on site that were actually directing psychological operations to the branch Davidians. There were members of the British SAS, and there was British look-down heat-seeking radar capability equipment on site. They were using British aircraft as reconnaissance aircraft with look-down heat-seeking radar, and the whole thing was really an exercise in terror. And whatever the reason for the whole thing, it has not been disclosed as of yet.
You know, we have a call, but before we take the call on the line, the bottom line here, you've had a chance to speak with Linda Thompson, who did a very, very interesting videotape called The Big Lie, Waco, Texas, The Big Lie. Do you have any opinions or suspicions about this?
Well, we know that most of the Branch Davidians were dead early on the morning that the fire started. Long before the fire started, they were dead. We know that teams were sent in to execute these people. We know that the fire was set by the forces that placed the church under siege. We do not know exactly which force sent these teams in. We know that the tanks had flamethrowers on them, and that's plainly visible in Linda's film, The Big Lie. There's an awful lot about Waco, Texas that that more people should be interested in discovering what's going on instead of accepting what they've been told. I was absolutely amazed when I heard Americans say they're just a bunch of religious nuts, they deserve to die, or they're just a bunch of religious nuts, they deserve what they got. This is not the American way. And I might remind all of your listeners that when you take the rights away from one, you take the rights away from all. And when you accept the propaganda and the lies, which, in effect, what happened, Bruce, was these people were executed, and their execution was accepted by the American people simply because they were politically incorrect. And that is extremely dangerous, because what it means is all they have to do is pin a label of political incorrectness on you in order to justify murdering you without due process, without being convicted in a court of law. This is so alien to the American ideology and the principles and ideals upon which this nation was founded, and for what Americans profess to believe in and be willing to be ready to fight and die for, that it's beyond me how the whole thing ever occurred.
KCSB FM 91.9 in Santa Barbara. Bruce Stephen Holmes for Timeless Voyager Radio. My guest today, if you have not gotten it yet, you should write his name down. William Cooper, author of Behold the Pale Horse, among other books. Certainly a very controversial guest. We are talking about just about every conspiracy that you can think of. I explained to you once again how the phones work: 893-2424, 893-2425, 893-2426. You will be able to address Bill through the phone, but he will not be able to answer you, and that is because of the way things are hooked up here at the station. But he can hear you, and I assure you that he's very interested in your calls. We'll take the first one. Bill, I'll put you on hold, and you'll be able to hear through the phone, hopefully. If not, I'll be able to repeat it for you.
Okay.
All right.